The story everybody knows begins on a village green in Massachusetts, April 19th, 1775. Lexington. 70-odd militiamen standing in the dawn against a column of British regulars, a shot from somewhere nobody could identify, and the war that made a nation. The shot heard round the world. That's where the revolution starts, in the school books, in the paintings, in the films, a clean opening scene with a clean date. But push back from that morning, back past the Boston Tea Party, back past the crates of tea in the harbour, back nearly 3 full years, and you find something that doesn't fit the tidy version at all. A June night in Rhode Island, a British warship stranded on a sandbar in the dark, boats sliding out from Providence with their oarlocks muffled, packed with merchants and sea captains and farm boys carrying pistols and clubs. A British naval officer shot down on his own deck, his crew driven off at gunpoint, and then the fire, a vessel of the Royal Navy burning to the waterline while the men who did it rowed home through the smoke. That was 1772, not a protest, not a riot over a tax. Colonists attacked a commissioned warship of the most powerful navy on earth, shot its commander, and destroyed the king's property in the king's own waters. In London, they had a precise word for it, and the word was treason. And here's the part that should stop you. Nobody was ever punished, not one man hanged, not one man tried. Hundreds of people in Rhode Island knew exactly who had gone out in those boats that night, and for years, not a single one of them talked. The Crown's response to this attack, the thing London decided to do about it, would frighten the American colonies more than any tax ever had. It would push 13 separate, squabbling, jealous colonies to build the machinery that let them finally act as one. Pull that thread and you find the road that runs straight to the Tea Party, to the Continental Congress, to Lexington itself. So the question isn't whether something happened before that famous morning on the green. Something did, and it was an open act of war. The question is why the burning of a British warship, 3 years ahead of the shooting, isn't the scene every American child learns first. The answer isn't a cover-up. It's stranger than that, and a good deal more human. It has to do with the fact that these men won, completely, cleanly, with no martyrs and no trial and no famous picture to hang on a wall. To understand it, you have to start with the ship, and with the officer who made himself the most hated man in Rhode Island in 4 short months. To understand why Rhode Island exploded, you have to understand what Rhode Island was. It was small, it was stubborn, and it lived off the sea. Narragansett Bay was a maze of coves and inlets and hidden channels, and Providence and Newport had grown rich on trade, a great deal of it conducted with a cheerful disregard for British customs law. Molasses, rum, sugar, wine. The colony's merchants had spent decades quietly moving cargo without troubling to pay every duty London demanded. Smuggling wasn't a shameful secret there. It was close to the local industry, and the men who ran it were the pillars of the community. For years, the Crown had mostly shrugged. Then, after the enormous expense of the war with France, Parliament decided the colonies would help pay for the empire that protected them, and the enforcement began in earnest. Customs schooners appeared in American waters with orders to stop the smuggling and collect what was owed. In February of 1772, one of them dropped anchor in Narragansett Bay. She was the Gaspee, an armed revenue schooner of the Royal Navy, and she was commanded by a lieutenant named William Dudingston. Dudingston took his orders seriously, and then some. He patrolled the bay relentlessly, stopping vessels, boarding them, searching them, seizing cargo he judged illegal. He didn't limit himself to the big smuggling runs, small local traders, market boats, coasters carrying goods from one Rhode Island town to another. He stopped them all. To the colonists, it felt less like law enforcement than like being occupied. Farmers lost produce, merchants lost shipments. Ordinary business on the bay slowed to a crawl under the eye of a single ship. What made it unbearable was the manner of it. In the colonists' telling, Dudingston was arrogant and dismissive, contemptuous of local officials and local courts, answerable to nobody in Rhode Island. When the colony's own authorities demanded he show his commission and submit to local law, he brushed them off. Rhode Island's governor complained. The Royal Navy backed its officer and warned the colony against interfering. So there it stood, a British officer operating inside the colony's own waters, seizing the property of its people, and no legal channel existed that could touch him. Every avenue the colonists tried, petitions, complaints, the courts, ran into the same wall. The law offered no remedy, because the law was the thing being used against them. By the spring of 1772, the fury around the bay had curdled into something dangerous. The merchants of Providence were not radicals by nature. They were businessmen with fortunes to protect. But they had reached the point where the only question left was not whether to act, but what act they could get away with. They needed an opening. On the 9th of June, the wind, the tide, and Dudingston's own aggression handed them a perfect one. The trap, if it was a trap, worked beautifully. That afternoon, a packet boat called the Hannah was making her way up the bay toward Providence. The Gaspee spotted her and gave chase, as she had chased so many others. The Hannah's captain knew these waters the way Dudingston did not. He ran north, hugging the shallows off a stretch of shoreline, then called Namquid Point, and led the warship straight across a sandbar. The Hannah, light and shallow, skipped over. The Gaspee did not. She drove hard aground and stuck fast, and the tide was falling, which meant the King's schooner was pinned on her side in the mud, helpless, unable to bring her guns to bear, and going nowhere until the water came back in the small hours of the morning. Word reached Providence by evening, and the town understood instantly what it had been given. A drummer went through the streets. Men gathered at a waterfront tavern, Sabin's, where the plan came together fast. Go out tonight, take the ship, and be gone before dawn. They were led by two men who knew exactly what they were risking. John Brown was one of the wealthiest merchants in Providence, a man with everything to lose. Abraham Whipple was a hard, experienced sea captain who would later fight the Royal Navy under an American flag. Around them assembled a boatload of the town's substance and muscle, merchants, mariners, tradesmen, Brown's own brother among them. They blacked out the boats and muffled the oars with cloth so the tholes wouldn't knock. Sometime after midnight, the little flotilla pushed off and slid down the dark water toward the stranded schooner, armed with pistols, muskets, staves, and clubs. A sentry on the Gaspee finally saw shapes on the water and gave the challenge. Dudingston came up on deck in his nightshirt, shouting at the boats to stand off. Somebody in the darkness answered him, and then somebody fired. The ball struck Dudingston low in the groin. He went down on his own deck, bleeding badly, and with him went any chance the crew had of holding the ship. The raiders swarmed aboard. There was a short, ugly scuffle, and it was over. What happened next was oddly disciplined for a mob. They didn't kill anyone. They dressed the lieutenant's wound as best they could, and they put him and every one of his men into the boats and set them ashore, alive. Only then did they go to work on the ship. They stripped her of what they wanted, piled combustibles, and set her alight. The Gaspee burned through the rest of the night. When the flames reached her powder, she blew apart, and by sunrise there was nothing left of His Majesty's schooner but charred timbers in the shallows. The men rowed home in the dark, and in the morning, the colony of Rhode Island had committed an act of war against the British Empire. London's reaction was not confusion. It was cold, focused rage. This wasn't a mob breaking windows over a stamp tax. Subjects of the king had fired on a naval officer and destroyed a commissioned vessel of the Royal Navy. The word that came back from the government was unambiguous. This was high treason, and the men responsible would answer for it. Enormous rewards were posted for information, sums large enough to change a working man's life forever. And the Crown appointed a Royal Commission of Inquiry, a special body created to find the culprits, sitting outside Rhode Island's ordinary courts. There was a bitter joke buried in its makeup. The man named to head it was Joseph Wanton, Rhode Island's own governor, seated alongside a Crown lawyer and 3 colonial chief justices. London had put a Rhode Islander in charge of hunting Rhode Islanders and expected it to work. Then came the detail that turned a local crime into a continental crisis. The commission wasn't empowered to try anybody in America. Its job was to identify the guilty and hand them over, to be shipped across the Atlantic and tried in England under an old treason statute dating back to the reign of Henry VIII. Read that again, and read it the way a colonist in 1772 read it. It meant an Englishman in America could be seized in his own town, put aboard a ship, carried 3,000 miles from every witness who knew him, and tried for his life before a jury of strangers in a country he had never seen. It meant the right that Englishmen considered the bedrock of their liberty, trial by a jury of your neighbors, in the place where the deed was done, simply did not apply to Americans when London decided it shouldn't. Taxes were money. This was something else. This was the machinery of the state reaching across an ocean to take a man out of his own community and swallow him. And Rhode Island answered with something remarkable: silence. Hundreds of people knew what had happened that night. They knew whose boats went out, whose sons had gone with them, who had fired the shot. The raiders were not shadowy strangers. They were the leading men of Providence, walking the same streets every day. The commission sat. It took testimony. It dangled fortunes in front of servants and sailors and dockhands. Nobody talked. Not one useful witness came forward, not for money, not for mercy. Testimony evaporated, memories failed, and identifications collapsed. In the end, the commission was forced to conclude that the Gaspee had been destroyed by persons unknown, and it dissolved without sending a single man to England. The Crown had been openly defied and then stonewalled by an entire community. But the damage was already done, not to Rhode Island and not to the raiders. The damage was to Britain, because every other colony had been watching, and what they had seen was a threat that could just as easily be pointed at them. The colonies had always been jealous of one another. 13 separate governments, 13 sets of interests, 13 assemblies that squabbled over borders and trade and precedents. Britain's greatest advantage had always been that they never acted together. The Gaspee Commission is where that began to break. Because the threat London had made in Rhode Island was not a Rhode Island threat. If the Crown could seize a Rhode Islander and ship him to England for trial, it could seize a Virginian, a Carolinian, a New Yorker. Every colonial leader on the continent looked at that commission and saw the same thing, a precedent aimed at all of them. Massachusetts moved first, with a committee to watch the crisis. But the decisive step came from the largest colony of all. On March 12, 1773, 9 months after the burning, the Virginia House of Burgesses, alarmed by the Gaspee inquiry and the prospect of Americans being carried overseas for trial, adopted resolutions creating a standing committee of correspondence charged with gathering intelligence on British encroachments and communicating with the other colonies. That was the hinge. Not a battle, not a speech, a committee. Within months, colony after colony built its own, and the 13 governments that had never managed to cooperate suddenly had a nervous system, a permanent, standing network for sharing warnings and coordinating a common response. Fast, without waiting for London's permission. Look at what happens next through that lens. When the tea-ships arrived at the end of 1773, the reaction was not one town acting alone. It moved through the network. When Britain answered Boston with the coercive acts in 1774, the network carried the alarm and produced the First Continental Congress, 12 colonies in one room. And when the regulars marched on Lexington in the spring of 1775, they marched into a continent that was already wired together and ready to answer as one body. None of that machinery existed before the Gaspee burned. So why isn't this the opening scene of the American story? Not because it was hidden. It's recorded, studied, and celebrated every year in Rhode Island. It's missing from the popular version for a reason that's almost funny. These men succeeded too completely. Revolutions remember their martyrs. Boston had bodies in the snow and a famous engraving of redcoats firing on a crowd. Lexington had dead militiamen on a green and a line of poetry that every schoolchild memorizes. The Gaspee raiders gave history none of that. Nobody died. Nobody hanged. There was no trial, no speech from a scaffold, no painting to make it holy. They struck the first real blow against the crown, then rode home, kept their mouths shut, and got away with it clean. That's the strange arithmetic of how a nation remembers. The night that lit the fuse produced no martyr, and so the story went to the men who fell, and the ones who slipped home in the dark became a footnote. The revolution didn't begin with a shot heard round the world. It began with a fire nobody was punished for, on a sandbar in Rhode Island, 3 years before the world was listening.